Hello dear followers, welcome back to Sunny Notting Hill, your favourite YouTube channel. My name's Paul Shepherd and today I'm going to tell you the story of a very famous science fiction novel, and it's been written by one of the greatest of sci-fi writers of all time. I'm referring to somebody called Herbert George Wells, better known to the world as H.G. Wells. And he was a very accomplished English writer, born in the middle of the 19th century, lived a very long life, and eventually he died in 1946 at the age of 80 after a very long and successful career. At the time he was born in a place called Bromley on the outskirts of modern London, England was going through a process of mass industrialization. There were factories popping up everywhere, not just in London, but particularly in the middle of England, in the north of England as well, and also in Scotland and Wales. A mass program of industrialization where the factories where goods were produced were owned by a very selective few people. The owners of the factories grew very rich indeed. The people who worked on their premises in their factories were treated pretty badly, were paid very low wages, and lived in conditions of squalor with no benefits at all. It was an age when the poor people had short life expectancy. They found it very difficult to make a living and to put food on the table. But as this was going on, the very rich were getting richer and richer. That's the background to this novel, and also to Wells' early life when he was a small boy and up until the end of the 19th century. The book we're going to deal with is called The Time Machine. Now, this is actually my favourite H.G. Wells novel, and it's one of his most famous novels. It's incredibly influential. It was actually written and published in 1895, and since that time there have been so many books about time travel, so many movies, so many stories. So Wells, we can say, is really extremely influential with this particular novel. As I said, the owners of the factory, they lived a very privileged life. They lived a life of luxury. They spent a lot of money. They had everything that they needed. And it was a time of exploitation, of subjugation. The poor, the workers, were held in their place by these very rich people, the capitalists and the bourgeoisie of the time. They got very rich, whereas the poor got very little benefit at all. They merely existed. Perhaps some people would look at this novel and, having read it, they might think it's like looking into a dystopian crystal ball where we look at humankind in the future and we think of it as a kind of lesson in class war, how the workers disliked the capitalists and the bourgeoisie who owned all the property. And we might think it's a dystopian crystal ball we're looking into. Later on in the novel, after we go 800,000 years into the future to meet the descendants of the human race, after that point in time, our time traveller travels on millions and millions of years into the future when our planet is in an apocalyptic state. There's no future for the planet. It's a dying planet. The sun is a dying sun. Landscape of the planet is a scene of desolation. It's apocalyptic. There's no future, no hope, simply oblivion. Before we go into the story, let's take a little look at H.G. Wells and his life. He went to a school called the Normal School of Science when he was a young student. Now, this Normal School of Science was in a place called South Kensington, which is very close to where I live, where I'm speaking to you from. It's probably about less than 3 miles away. And this Normal School of Science is now developed into what we call Imperial College in London. It includes some very famous museums, scientific museums. It's Britain's foremost scientific University. And Wells went to this school and he studied under a very famous man called Huxley, T.E. Huxley. He was Wells' teacher, and Huxley was a disciple of the great Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin also worked at the school, and he was the man who wrote the very famous, or some people might say the infamous book, The Origin of the Species, the theory of evolution, how life, how fauna and flora developed on our planet. And this is what interested Wells, and this is what he was taught. He was taught the theory of evolution. This theory figures very highly in a lot of his works. A lot of his works reflect scientific subjects, and The Time Machine is no exception at all. It talks about a man who travels far into the future, and one of the main subjects of the book is human evolution. What happens to our race from 1895, when the book was written and published, up until 802,701, a long way ahead of where we are now. And planet Earth and London is very different indeed, a very different kind of civilization. So there we have evolution, which was a focal point for Wells' attention. His other great intellectual interest was society and politics. He regarded the lot of the workers and the squalor and the poverty they lived in, the way they were treated by the capitalists and the bourgeoisie. He was totally appalled by it, and he was an ardent social reformer. All his life in the 19th century, as socialism was developing, Wells became a devout socialist, and he remained so for his entire life. And this is reflected in his novels as well as the theories of evolution. Not long before Wells wrote his book, or before he was born actually, Karl Marx wrote and published his Communist Manifesto. This was in 1848, and Marx's idea was to have a fair society, a classless society, where there was social justice and equality and fairness for everybody. These ideas appealed greatly to H.G. Wells, and Wells was so enamoured with these theories that when Marx's greatest disciple, Lenin, and his associates founded the Soviet Union in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution, Wells actually travelled to the Soviet Union, and he met Lenin and discussed socialism with him. So he met the founder of the first communist state. Later on, in the 1930s, Wells returned to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and on that occasion he met none other than Joseph Stalin, and the two of them discussed world politics, world society and history. By the time that Wells met Stalin, he was a well-respected author and commentator on global affairs. So he was very much respected, well-known. Everybody had heard of this man, and he'd written quite a lot of very highly acclaimed material by the 1930s. Let's have a look at our story. Our story is about the time machine, obviously. And the time machine, of course, is operated by the time traveller. Now, Wells didn't give the time traveller a name. He simply told us that he lived in a place called Richmond-upon-Thames. Now, those of you who don't know London, the River Thames flows through our city, and if you go slightly west from where I'm sat now, about 10 miles away, the river flows through a very beautiful town called Richmond-upon-Thames. It's a very leafy, modern suburb of London now, but back in the 1890s, this is where our time traveller lived. He invented two machines, one small machine and a larger machine, and he invited his friends round to dinner so that he could discuss his theories of time travel and to show off his pieces of scientific work. His friends came round, he discussed time travel. You can imagine in the late 1890s how his friends were more than a little bit sceptical. They probably thought he was completely mad. But he had a little device on the table which was a miniature time machine, and he put a little lever into it. He flicked the lever and suddenly it faded from view. It went off into a kind of haze and disappeared. There was no trickery. He wasn't a magician. So where did this little device go? Did it go off to the past? Did it go to the future? But it did go somewhere. But no trickery or no magic, that's for sure. When his guests left the house, shortly afterwards, he went to the room where his big time machine had been assembled. He mounted the machine. He had his normal clothes on. He had a box of matches. He wasn't exactly well prepared to head into the future, but he got onto his machine. He fixed the levers into it that would start it to move, and presto, he pushed the levers. Straight away, something very strange happened. He sensed he was moving away from the present time. Things began to speed up a little bit. It got faster and faster. He watched the sun come up over the horizon and go down the opposite horizon in a matter of seconds. The moon came up over the horizon. It went down the other side under the horizon, all in a matter of seconds. Civilization began to race before his eyes, and he went faster and faster. He began to feel a bit wobbly on his machine. It was going along at a tremendous pace. He felt a little bit odd, but he still continued to go faster and faster into the future. Eventually, the movement of the machine and the fact that he felt wobbly, he'd had enough, and he pulled the lever slowly but surely, and gradually the speed declined and he came to a stop. He landed on a very grassy patch, and very close to him there were bushes with very beautiful flowers, and to his left there was a huge building in the form of a sphinx. He looked at the dial on his time machine, and to his surprise he'd actually come as far as the year 802,701. He'd landed on a grassy area where his house used to be. The river was close by, still the River Thames presumably. Maybe it wasn't called the River Thames. But he'd landed in the future. Everything was clean and tidy. There was beautiful grass, beautiful flowers, and everything seemed to be so clinically clean. He hadn't been very long stable with his machine when he saw little people approaching him. Little human people dressed in long robes. They were much smaller than the people of the present day. They were very childlike in appearance, very delicate, small limbs, tiny little faces like porcelain faces. They all had curly hair, and all the men and the women looked the same. But there were men and women, but they all tended to look the same. They were very delicate little people. But the thing that he noticed about them, they asked him where he came from, which would have been a very interesting thing to most people. But when he told them, they didn't seem a little bit interested. And they merely went off, and they went away and did frivolous things, dancing about, playing with flowers. Then some others would come up to him and they would ask questions, but they had absolutely no interest what was going on around them. They were almost imbecilic. They had no curiosity about anything. And there he was with this very strange machine, and he was much bigger than them, but they didn't have any curiosity at all. There was something very odd about them, and obviously they were the descendants of 19th century people, but their brains, it seems, were very different indeed. No curiosity, no interest in life, and no idea of the history of their species and how they came to be like they were. He discovers they live in a very big communal building, and he goes to live with them as their guest. Everything is so idyllic, everything is so clean, everything is so calm, and everything's very orderly. And he wonders to himself, did Marx's theories come to fruition? Was he now in a time with these rather pretty little people? And was this communism, after all these years, was he actually living with people who were living a perfect idyllic life in a communist society? We shall learn more about these people in a minute. He lives with them, as I said. They eat fruit. That's all they eat. There's no meat. There's no bread, nothing like that. It's simply a diet of fruit. And he stays with them for several days, but then he's very curious about the fruit and the people. Who supplies them with the fruit? He doesn't see them doing any work. He doesn't see them go out and gather fruit. And who makes the beautiful robes that they wear? Who maintains the buildings? Who does any work at all? They certainly don't. They're very frivolous. They play, they pick flowers, they run around, they make love. They don't do anything else. So who supplies all these things? Who helps them out? Who sustains them? But another curious thing about them, he discovers very quickly, they are absolutely terrified of the dark. Whenever the dusk arrives, they go back to their big communal building as fast as they can. They go inside where it's light. They are afraid to go outside. They are terrified of the dark. He doesn't know why at this point, but he's very curious about the very bizarre behavior of these people. He stays with them for a while. And one day he goes to the river with them. One of the women falls into the river and she screams and she shouts. She can't swim. She's obviously going to drown. Not one of her companions raises a finger to help her. They just carry on doing frivolous things and running around. This poor woman is in the river and she's going to be swept away. So the time traveller, he dives into the river. He saves her. He saves her from a very unpleasant death. Turns out her name is Weena. And he speaks to her. She becomes his constant companion. He's a kind of saviour to her. He asks Weena about society. How did things happen like this? How come the Eloi live like they do? Who supplies the fruit? Who supplies the robes? They know nothing. They have no interest in anything. But Weena becomes his companion. When he goes back to the position where his time machine was, next to the Sphinx, it's gone. And there are marks on the grass leading to the door of the Sphinx. So somebody or something has dragged it across the grass and it's now inside the Sphinx. The door is shut. There's no way he can get in and get his machine out to go back to his own time if he so wishes. But it's been taken, and at the moment he's stranded 800,000 plus years' time. He wonders who could have taken it, and he also notes across this grassy terrain where he's now living, there are wells with little hoods over the top of the wells to keep the rain out, presumably. And he wonders what is down these wells. And he goes to look down these wells, and Weena is with him. She's absolutely terrified. She doesn't want him to go anywhere near this well. But he looks down and he listens, and he can hear machinery, heavy machinery. Thud, 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 coming up from under the ground, but complete darkness as he looks down. And he surmises that he may have to go down this well to find how to get into the Sphinx. Weena is absolutely desperate. She really does not want him to enter this well, but enter he does. He goes down, down. It gets darker and darker. He looks up. He can see Weena's head far above looking down at him. Then she suddenly just disappears. Eventually he gets to the bottom. He can hear the machinery. He gets out his box of matches and he lights a match. And there he is in a very different world. He can see masses of machinery, and he can see a very different kind of species operating and looking after this machinery. They're very different to the Eloi on the present surface of the planet. They're rather like apes. They're not very tall, but they're ape-like. They have huge bloodshot eyes because they live permanently in the dark. They have no chins. They're rather grotesque-looking creatures, but above all, they're pretty aggressive. They don't like the look of the intruder who's come down into their well, and they're pretty violent towards him. The other thing he notices is the fact that he can smell fresh meat. Now, where does the fresh meat come from? There are no animals on the surface. The Eloi are only eating fresh fruit. Doesn't appear to be any meat available. And then he surmises the smell of the meat, and he links the rather ape-like people. They're called the Morlocks. They are treating the Eloi like cattle and sheep in a field. They are farming them, and they are abducting them, killing them, cutting up and putting them on the table for food. So the Morlocks are actually eating the Eloi. They're the main thing on the menu. He surmises what's going on here. There are these very delicate little creatures on the surface, and these rather unpleasant, grotesque creatures living down the well. And he works out for himself that the people on the surface, the Eloi, are descended from the rich, the bourgeoisie, the capitalists of the 19th century. And the Morlocks are descended from the workers of the 19th century. And over the thousands of years and thousands of generations, the human race has split into two very separate species. They don't look alike anymore. They don't think alike anymore. And they have different purposes on the planet. One spends their whole life in frivolity, and no wonder they're scared of the Morlocks, because the Morlocks abduct them in the dark, take them down below the surface, and put the knife to them, and they are eaten on the dinner table. So we have this very unpleasant arrangement between these two species. The Morlocks chase him. He goes back up to the surface. He climbs up through the well very quickly to get away from them. But he realizes somehow he's going to have to get into their dark world in order to retrieve his machine so that he can get back to the 1890s. So we have their the Eloi on the surface and the very dark, murky world of the Morlocks. 800,000 years' time. Humanity has gone up a blind alley. There is no curiosity left in the human race, no scientific research, no intellectual interest, no spiritual interest. And it seems that the human race has ceased to develop. They've gone into what's known as retrogressive, degenerative evolution. They've gone backwards in time, and Homo sapiens, as we call ourselves now, is now facing extinction. There is no development at all with these new species, and humankind is about to go into extinction, rather like Neanderthal man, or the woolly mammoth, or the saber-toothed tiger. There is no future for the human race at all. He has time to go and look around the area where he is living, and he takes Weena and they go to a distant building, a very old building which is fairly desolate actually. It's falling to pieces. They go inside and it looks as if it may have been some sort of institution, some educational institution, or perhaps a museum, and wonder whether is this the remains of the Natural History Museum or Imperial College from his own age. Everything is falling to pieces. There's no way of gathering information from there. So the two of them, the time traveller and Weena, they set off to go back to the communal building, back near the Sphinx. Weena gets tired, so they stop, they have a break. It starts to get dark. So they light a fire so they can see what they're doing. But it isn't very long before they are surrounded by Morlocks. There are lots and lots of them. They don't like the fire. They cover their eyes to get near the fire. But the fire gets out of control and it sets fire to the forest where the Morlocks are all looking at them. And there is a terrible blaze. Morlocks get incinerated. Some rush around. They can't see where they're going because of the light. They crash into each other. The time traveller hits out at them. He kills some of them. The fire gets worse. But in all the chaos, in all the mayhem, Weena disappears. Where does Weena go? We don't know. We're not told in the story. Was she incinerated in the fire? Or did the Morlocks pick her up and run off and take her down the well to eat her? We're not told. We don't know what happened to Weena. But there was this terrible chaotic blaze and this terrible battle between this one Victorian man and all these Morlocks. Eventually, of course, the fire burns out, daylight comes back, and he goes back to where Weena's companions live. And he realises he's going to have to get his machine back. He goes down to the Sphinx, where the marks are on the grass, where the Morlocks have pulled the machine inside the Sphinx, and the door is open. And there in front of him is his time machine. It's even been cleaned. The Morlocks have been very helpful. They've cleaned his machine for him. But there it is in front of his eyes. All he has to do is climb on it, fix the levers in, and he will get away from this dreadful dystopian period in humankind's history. He goes towards his machine. The Morlocks are there waiting for him. They attack him. He fights them off. He has a weapon which he's fashioned to fight them with. He fights them. He lights matches. They shut the door. It goes dark. But he fights back. He knocks them. They try to grab. He can feel their horrible fingers on his body. But he manages to put the levers in his machine, and he presses, and slowly but surely his machine turns to a haze and leaves the Morlocks there totally bewildered. Where did he go? But he moves forward in time. He presses the lever. He's so desperate to get away from these ghastly creatures. He goes millions and millions of years into the future. When he finally stops, he looks to the horizon. The sun is no longer golden and yellow. It's no longer brightly shining. It's a huge semicircular red disk on the horizon. The planet has moved closer to the sun. The planet's also stopped rotating as well. So whoever's living there, if anybody, all they do is they see the half red sun on the horizon. It's cold, it's desolate, it's totally apocalyptic. The only sign of life is some very unpleasant giant looking crabs crawling along the beach where he's landed. And there's some very giant butterflies flying in the air, making screeching noises. Perhaps they're screeching to get away from the crabs, we weren't told. But there he is on this beach. The sea is still, the air is still, it's very cold, it's apocalyptic, there's no hope. It's the end of our planet, it's the end of time for Mother Earth. As he sits there, one of the crabs touches him very gently. He puts the levers into his machine and spins, I think, 10 million years ahead again. He's still on the beach. There's other crabs there. It gets very cold. It gets colder and colder. It starts snowing. What's he going to do? He can't just stand there or sit there. He decides that now is the time to try and return to the late 19th century, to his house in Richmond-upon-Thames. So he puts the levers in his machine, applies them, and he tries to go back. He hopefully is heading for Richmond-upon-Thames. It's a long journey back, a long, precarious journey. He wobbles about. He's not very comfortable. When he eventually gets back to his house, he gets off his time machine and he walks into his dining room, and there are all his friends waiting for him. They're waiting to have dinner with him. And there he is. He's been away all this time. He's been millions and millions of years ahead, and he's gone back, and there are his friends waiting. He looks terrible. He's been roughed up by the Morlocks. His feet are bleeding. His clothes are in a mess. They're very dirty. In his pocket he has the flowers that the Eloi have given him. And he looks at his guests there, and he tells his very bizarre story to his guests. Guess what? Nobody believes him, do they? He comes out with this tale of the Morlocks and the Eloi and the end of the planet in millions and millions of years' time. So he's left with these doubters in his dining room. He decides to use his time machine again to return to the age of the Morlocks and the Eloi. And his intention is to find Weena before she is lost in the forest fire, and to bring her back to the 19th century. He gets on his machine, he applies his levers, and he goes into the future. His housekeeper is there, one of his friends is there. The machine turns to a haze. He goes forward into the future. 3 years later, they're still waiting. He's never seen again. He decides he's going to find Weena and bring her back. This raises all kinds of scientific questions. Parallel universe, time warps, committing the act of bringing someone from one time back to another time. We don't know if this is possible. We don't know if time travel is possible. Really, this would be great fun for somebody like Einstein to figure out, is it possible to go to the future and to come back again? So we have this wonderful story, this wonderful romantic story with these very frightening characters called the Morlock and these delicate little creatures called the Eloi. And then the very desperate and depressive view of the very distant future as our planet is dying. A wonderful romantic story, not a very cheerful story. There's no happiness in this story at all. And he disappears at the end and we don't know what's happened to him. So a wonderful story, and this story is extremely influential. If you look from the late 19th century up to our own time, let's say 130 odd years, and how this story has influenced science fiction, books, movies, television, even theatre. There's a theatre production, Back to the Future. So this is very influential. One of his most influential books, and he wrote many influential ones. And as I say, this one is my favourite, my particular favourite. I highly recommend you to go and buy it. Here it is next to me. It's not a long book. It's not difficult to read. It was his first full-length romantic novel. He wrote a lot of short stories. He was also a theatre critic and a book critic. But he wrote this in 1895, his first full-length novel. In fact, it's not a long novel, so we might even say novella. I highly recommend this. It's very entertaining. There's been a couple of movies made of it. One was in 1960, and the other one was in this century. I'm afraid I can't find much kind to say about either of these movies. They don't follow the book very closely. We meet the Morlocks and the Eloi. The Morlocks are pretty gruesome and the Eloi are pretty feeble, that's for sure. I wouldn't recommend these movies, but that's up to you. If you want to try and watch them, you can write in and tell me what you think, how much you enjoyed them or otherwise. So thanks a lot, dear followers. Thank you so much for coming today. We hope to see you again soon. In the meantime, enjoy yourselves and take good care.